Welcome to the panel about managing Russian assertiveness in the post-Cold War era. Russia's involvement in Ukraine illustrates its increasing assertiveness. So what should Europe do when facing these ambitions? Is a strong civil society in Russia possible? Will Russia back down over Ukraine and build a more cooperative relationship with Europe? We encourage you to debate on these matters.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second panel. We are very fortunate to have four very distinguished panelists. I'll invite them on now, because each of them not only are analysts, but are also practitioners in foreign policy and have direct experience with President Putin's Russia. So in order of appearance, we have, and please come up as I call your names, Adam Daniel Rotfeld, former Polish foreign minister and currently co-chair of a group called the Polish-Russian Group for Difficult Matters, and I hope it hasn't been renamed for Impossible Matters. Please, Adam. Round of applause, thank you. Okay, second we have, in order of appearance, and I see the name is right here, is Giorgi Bokeria, former First Deputy Foreign Minister of Georgia. Giorgi, please. And third, my good friend, somebody we've been working with for over 20 years in Washington, the former Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Member of Parliament, founder of the Kiev-based Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation, Borys Tarasiuk. Borys, please. And last but not least, former Czech Secretary for Foreign Affairs and Director of the Diplomatic Academy in Prague, Cyril Svoboda. Please, Cyril. Okay, I'm going to jump straight in because I think our time has already been cut back by 10 minutes. So I was initially asked to be a panelist and then asked to be a moderator. So I developed some ideas that I wanted to present in a panel, so I'm going to be naughty and do that anyway. But then formulate some questions for the four panelists. And all of us are going to be brief answers to brief questions, and I'll try and get as many in as possible and then open up to the audience. So let me begin by being a bit controversial by actually contesting the title of the panel, which is Managing Russia. I do not believe we should be managing Russia. I think that's an outmoded term given the aftermath of the attack on Ukraine. I think what we should be doing is two things: thwarting Moscow's foreign policy ambitions, whatever that takes, and however we agree to do that. And secondly, pursuing Russia's transformation, which I think is essential. Because while Moscow continues its war against Ukraine, Western leaders, unfortunately, are still debating on how to deal with a neo-imperial Kremlin that subverts the independence and territorial integrity of its neighbors. In fact, some Western capitals even seem willing to accept Russia's partition of Ukraine. Notice how it said Crimea and Ukraine. Crimea is a part of Ukraine. It's not a separate entity, but it's creeping into the language already. The calculation being that appeasement can somehow satisfy Moscow's appetite. Well, it certainly didn't in the case of Georgia 6 years ago. Why should it now? There are other targets of opportunity. Unfortunately, I think attempts at reconciliation at this point with Putin bring only temporary pauses in what is a much longer geopolitical struggle, which Russia already is engaged in, and I think we should be engaged in as well. And I believe that Putin has staked his presidency on the success of this struggle. As somebody said this morning, Putin will probably stay in the Kremlin to the very end, whether he comes out head first or feet first. And I'm convinced that the West ultimately confronts two stark choices: either help facilitate the collapse of Putinism, or face years of insecurity, with pauses in between, of course, that will undermine both NATO and the EU, both the alliance and the European Union. So, coming to my question, in recent weeks we have heard a lot about the economic crisis in Russia. In other words, falling oil prices, lack of investment, falling ruble, living standards potentially about to fall. So my first question to each of our panelists is, does this portend the beginning of destabilization in Russia? And is this something that we should welcome? In other words, some Western policymakers and analysts fear that Russian destabilization, change of regime, insecurity in Russia itself will be worse for the West. I even heard somebody say this morning on this European Union panel that maybe we should be easing the sanctions because it threatens Putin's survival or the survival of this regime. So what are your views on this? And maybe this is a question for all four of you. So maybe I'll start with Adam. And if you could try and limit yourself to 5 minutes, I'd appreciate that very much.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. I will tell you that since we are limited to 5 minutes, for obvious reason, I will say by titles and not, I will not be able to develop what I'm thinking. I would like to say that the present situation is byproduct not of the strength of Russia, but of the weakness of Russia. Russia, in fact, failed to modernize itself. These 25 years of initiated by perestroika and later on by the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was a chance to transform Russia in a very modern way. What happened, for example, in many parts with all the disadvantages. But I would like to say, nevertheless, not only comparing with Poland, but for example, the 3 Baltic states. They were integral part of the Soviet Union. And now they are developed in a totally different way. Okay, some people would say in Russia that it is not comparable because of the scale. But scale in case of Russia is exactly a great advantage. In addition, Russia has enormous raw materials, especially resources of gas and energy. And it was, in my view, a kind of the disadvantage in a sense that Russia is condemned to fail because it was demoralization of the whole leadership of Russia. It was possible to pay off, to secure, I would say, on very low level the pensions and to keep all the social assurances on the level comparable to that in the Soviet Union or even lower, but nevertheless it was not a crisis. Altogether, I would like to say that in my view, Russia at the moment is not in a crisis. I just, before the beginning of our session, I have with Borys a very brief exchange, and I told him that the Germans are using such an expression, Flucht nach vorn, that means escape to the future. And as far as the Russia invasion of Crimea and the aggression against Ukraine, it is escape to the past. In other words, they applied, I would say, the ways and forms of justification, legitimization of the Russian ambitions, not by the development as it was possible to do, as it was suggested by the European Union and by the democratic world in the form of the modernization, but they decided simply by consolidating people around leadership of Russia and the beginning of very strange war. It is, I would say, something what is new. It is not invasion of Crimea and the invasion of the southeastern part of Ukraine, but it is, I would say, the use of force as a kind of the method which is not only prohibited by international law, but all the agreements which were concluded, bilateral agreements with, between Ukraine and Russia, and multilateral. not saying about this Budapest Agreement of the 5th of December 94, but also tripartite between Russia, United States, and Ukraine in Moscow, 14th January 94. All these agreements were forgotten, were not only violated, but even the Prime Minister of Russia has had the courage to say that it is curious to expect that integrity of the state could have a kind of the international guarantees. And I would like to say that all the nations, we have the guarantees of integrity of state.
That applies to Russia as well in that.
Yes. In other words, now I'm coming to an end to say that, in fact, it is possible. The question is, for example, whether it is possible to cooperate with Russia, especially whether it is possible to cooperate within security area. I would say yes, it is possible under the condition and under the premises that Russia will confirm, and not only in words but in deeds, the respect and observance of the commitments which were taken and international obligations in all basic instruments of international law and political commitments under the Helsinki Final Act and many other commitments which I mentioned earlier. Altogether, I will stop here with an intention later on to discuss with other panelists.
Of course. Thank you, Adam. Giorgi, what do you think? Whether there's a crisis or not, certainly Russia is facing a major economic downturn. This could generate economic, potentially a political struggle. Is this something we should welcome or something we should work against?
Absolutely, we should welcome that and do much more. It's not on? It is, it is. But first, very shortly, I want to just stress how much I appreciate to be honored to be part of this discussion and part of such a distinguished panel. It's a great news that such a forum has been launched in Warsaw, especially at such a difficult time. Jumping to your question, the first one and a follow-up, there should be no worries as a priority about what could happen if the free world manages to contain first and then defeat Putin. That would be disastrous premise to be worried about that as a priority and to be a hostage of that. And let me say a couple of words why I think that's part of the larger problem which was there for years now. Just like in medicine, in medical business, if there's no proper diagnosis of the situation, it's very hard to address the problem or to have a strategy. For years now, we've been hearing a discussion that the trouble in the relationship with post-Cold War Russia, with Putin's regime, Kremlin, the Kremlin is bigger than Putin even, the problem, was vulnerability of Russia, humiliation of once great empire, anxiety about NATO enlargement, sensitivity about Russian minorities, you name it, all of these issues. I'm not saying those things which were crafted by Kremlin itself were taken all the time on board. They were luckily not all the time taken on board or were partially taken on board, but they were accepted as legitimate topics of discussion. And I think there's a deep problem and a flawed thing. The fundamental issue is that we are facing a regime which is revisionist at its core, which has a goal of revisiting the outcome of the Cold War. Even the issue of dominating its neighbors is just a part of it. I'm not saying they will be able to invade further tomorrow, but the goal of Putin has been very clear. He has spoken about that publicly. He has said that the post-89 arrangements are to the detriment of Russia, and he intends to change it, and he has acted upon it. So there has been complete misunderstanding of the structure of the regime. So Russia has been dealt with difficult or very difficult partner, or partner which went crazy, or potential partner. This is a problem. It must be treated as it is. It cannot be a partner as it is now. It cannot wish to be a partner because the goal of it is to destroy the Euro-Atlantic order. It wants US out, Europe divided and dominated. The structure of the regime, to a bit simplify it, is very, very clear. We have a KGB backbone, which Putin embodies himself, which is deeply revanchist because it strives for power. And how can they have more world power? By again destroying the very idea of Europe whole and free and peace, and again, Euro-Atlantic architecture. They have contract with the money factor, the corrupt factor, and I agree that Russia is fading power, but it might be fading power for a long time and can do a lot of damage. And we see that this structure of using money and corruption to infiltrate political and economic class of its neighborhood and deeper into Europe is not without success. And the third component, which has been, I think, for a long time being downplayed, ideological battle. I've heard many times that Russia should not in any way be compared with Soviet Union, post-Cold War Russia, in part because there's no ideological challenge. That communism was there, it thrived to win hearts and minds of the world people, and there's nothing in modern Russia like that. Well, I agree, nothing can compare to the challenge that communists posed for the freedom in general for the whole 20th century. But there is ideology, and we see this ideology of people articulated like Dugin. This is this Eurasianist fundamentalist ideology, which is not without success again. It is articulate, it's founded in anti-Western idea, saying that West is decadent, rotten, corrupt, as cynical as it is from the mouthpiece of Putin regime, dysfunctional, it threatens our family values, our identity. Look at Putin's speech last year. It was directed at Europe, and it has some success, unfortunately, not only in neighborhood, but we see, and everybody sees, in established European democracies, the rise of the far-right, far-left movements which are embracing this Putin idea. So it shouldn't be downplayed. But going back to diagnosis, and I'll finish very soon. So the diagnosis is clear. This is a power which must be confronted just like the Soviet Union was. I'm not saying the parallel is exact, God forbid, luckily not. But it is an adversary, it's a foe, must be treated as such, must be contained and eventually defeated. And there should be no worries, just like it was in the Soviet times, about instability as a priority. Once it's contained and destroyed, of course, then, and in parallel, maybe there should be a calculation about how to deal with post, but not before. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Boris, what is the view from Kyiv? You are under direct attack. Not you personally, but...
and personally as well. I remember when in 2000, or before 2000, Yeltsin was trying to convince Kuchma to dismiss me because I was too, on his point of view, too pro-Western and too anti-Russian. Well, I would like to say that only when Putin came to power, it became possible for him to dismiss me with the hands of Kuchma. Well, so it is personal as well. But coming back to your question about the economic problems Russia may be affected, I would say that, of course, Russian economy is being hurt by the sanctions of the European Union and of the United States. It is definitely, although Putin is trying to pretend that it is nothing serious. He is laughing at United West, saying that, well, this is not the problem. At the same time, the problem is hundreds of billions of dollars are being fled from the country of investments. The oil price is going down, and this is a serious damage to Russian economy. At the same time, to my mind, the basic assessment, my basic assessment, is that there is no economic price. Putin cannot allow Russia to pay for the exchange of its geopolitical ambitions. And in this regard, I would say that for many years, since the very beginning of the disruption of the former Soviet Union and formation of new independent states, Ukraine has taken a very clear, independent foreign policy role, unlike many other post-Soviet republics. And for Putin, it was a strategic objective to re-establish the domination of Russia over the former Soviet Union. And for him, Ukraine was a key for the restoration of this domination. So, and since Ukraine was resisting, this domination by Russia, for the Kremlin, for many years, this was a strategic objective to force Ukraine to be subordinate to Moscow. Since it was not the case, until Yanukovych came to power. So for Moscow, it was a kind of relief. And they were seemingly of the opinion that they got their guy in Kiev. So that's why they were about to reach, their strategic objective, to gain control over Ukraine. But the revolution of dignity and pro-European protests by young people in Ukraine exactly a year ago crossed, these plans of Putin. And, all of a sudden he understood that it is the high time for him to implement with other means his strategic objectives, with the means of aggression. So that's what he did. The time was chosen the most, I would say, the most preferable for aggressor. The people were, of the opinion that they have gained the victory over the dictator, Yanukovych, who fled the country. And they were of the opinion, we were of the opinion that this is a new era for us to build a new democracy again after the Orange Revolution. But it was in Putin's plans, and as a result, he used the opportunity when the Yanukovych fled the country, and the whole gang, when the new government was just formed and was in the process of settling, all the things. And that's how they started this provocative, a new, so to say, hybrid war in the Crimea. Using this opportunity, I would like to say that I know that our friends, neither overseas nor in major capitals here in Europe, were very helpful to us. The new authorities in Ukraine, the new democratic authorities in Ukraine were looking forward around for a help, for the assistance. And instead they have got the recommendations, read instructions, do not provoke Russia. As a result, our military were not given the instructions to defend the country, and that's how we lost the Crimea, hopefully temporarily. So I would say that NATO and Washington in particular are carrying a great deal of responsibility what happened in Ukraine. And until now, the West is not ready to meet this challenge Putin has posed before, and has not designed any viable, any adequate response to Putin. So for Putin, this is an opportunity to quest for a new geopolitical status globally. So that's why he is sending his warships to the northeastern Atlantic. That's why he is threatening countries of NATO with bombers, fighters flying over their territories or close to their territories. So this is a provocative activity, and I would say that, and I dare to say that we should not manage the assertiveness of Russia, we should manage the aggressiveness of Russia, and not in the post-Cold War era, but in the new Cold War era. So this is my conclusion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Boris. Cyril, what is the view from Prague?
Thank you so much for inviting me from Prague. I'm independent. So, in my country there's a very difficult dispute between the president and the government. But being Christian and Catholic, I believe in miracles. But being realistic, I am deeply convinced that we have no chance to change the system in Russia. Why? Because when I was in Russia, I met a student because I speak Russian, and I visited 3 universities, And I was shocked. The people, they spoke like radio, TV, Channel 1, or radio Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. So despite the fact that they have the direct access, maybe limited, but they have access to the internet. In the hotel, I can watch France 24, Deutsche Welle, and Euronews. Of course, maybe it is not accessible to everyone, but generally speaking, young people, they have a direct access to the other sources of information. But something is in the Russian mentality. Putin, he helped to raise the pride of the Russia. It is very important mentally for the Russian population, because those who are free and independent, those who criticize the system, they are in Russia, of course, brave people. But in my view, so I am very pessimistic. From the short-term period, that some substantial change is possible. But the sanctions, they have a direct influence on Russia, and it could help solve the problem of Ukraine. And the question, very important, is what is the real will of Europe? It is to change the system in Russia or to solve the problem of Ukraine. Please believe me, the priority number one is Ukraine. So, and I believe that there's a chance, maybe we will discuss the situation in Ukraine. I'm not going to switch my answer to the question of Ukraine, but I think that we can help in solving the problem of Ukraine. But the very last argument, when I met some people in Russia in their offices, so in every single office, on the wall there was the picture of Piotr Veliki, Peter the Great. So, and it is a new tradition which is in the mentality of the Ruské naселение, in the Russian nation. So I am terribly sorry that I may be disturbing the atmosphere, but I am very realistic. I was not shocked, but I was impressed in negative way how deeply rooted pride is now in the Russian nation among the normal people. Maybe I met wrong people, but I met students at the 3 universities, and it was very strong.
Okay, thank you, Cyril. I'm going to follow up on what you've said, actually, rather than sticking to some of the script that I had. Ukraine, and maybe Boris, you could answer this. What is the solution for Ukraine? You know, Russia wants one solution. Presumably, we want to maintain an integral Ukraine or restore an integral Ukraine and move it into Europe eventually. Russia does not want this. Russia, I think, wants two things: a frozen conflict in Donbass and a frozen state in terms of Ukraine's progress towards international institutions. So how do we arrive at that solution that Ukrainians want? Boris.
I wish I know the answer. From my point of view, Putin, by starting aggression against Ukraine, he had in mind a number of objectives. One of the objectives is not to allow Ukraine another chance to build a democratic European country. And another objective, which is connected with the first one, is not to give Russian people an example of successful democracy in the neighborhood. There were some byproducts of this aggression, among them to cut Ukraine from the Black Sea and to get as far as eastern borders of NATO. So this was my reading of the situation. But as to the possible solution, like Cyril, I don't see any possible solution, and as Gary Kasparov said, other than removing Putin from the Kremlin. So is it possible or not? This depends not on European Union nor on the United States, even nor on Ukraine. But for the time being, Ukraine is fighting alone with the aggressor. What may be the alternative? The alternative may be to bring the situation to the extreme, to create economic and social hardship for the population, which will protest massively against Putin. But I don't see any strong political opposition in nowadays Russia, which may lead the people. So I don't think that this is possible, but I do not exclude this possibility. Another solution of the problem is to have a concerted policy by the United Europe and the United States, which is not the case for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris. As a follow-up to this, and this idea that with Putin, no solution, without Putin, the possibility of a solution, what role do sanctions play? I mean, the sanctions, I've heard various opinions about the sanctions, that they're too weak, that they don't target the oligarchs enough, that in fact, there was an interview today I just read that there should be complete freezing of all bank accounts and any assets that Russian oligarchs tied to, or anybody tied to Putin. Or should there be sectoral sanctions or broader sanctions that, as Boris mentioned, could affect the population, maybe stir revolt? I mean, the sanctions haven't resulted in shock therapy, let's put it that way, in the Kremlin. What do you see as their role? Adam, maybe start with you.
Well, first of all, I would say that I do not consider sanctions as something very effective. Sanctions are always rather symbolic, and sanctions should be seen and evaluated after a rather long period, because you cannot expect that immediately after introduction some sanctions it will be an immediate effect. It happened, for example, with Cuba, with Iran, and both of them are much smaller, especially Cuba is a very small, poor country, but nevertheless they were able to survive. And I'm saying this with an intention to come to the conclusion that in Russia, in fact, the Russian people will tolerate the decrease of the standard of life, being motivated by psychological pressure to be united against the enemies who surrounded Russia and prepared a kind of the conspiracy, Russophobia, etc. I would like to say that it is my intention in my contact with Russians to tell them that critical comments about specific decisions or the policy of the country has nothing to do with Russophobia. And there are some Russophobes somewhere, probably also in Poland, but it is not, Poland is not motivated by Russophobia. And in case that it is, for example, presentation of some great performances by Russian artists, it is very difficult to get the tickets, and always it is great interest for the Russian literature, theater, and especially film and music. It has nothing to do with, nevertheless, in Russia, they are repeating again and again that they are Russophobes, and all that is motivated by Russophobia. Having said that, I would like to say that I'm for the sanctions, but the sanctions should be, so to say, smart sanctions, not in general, but first of all, those which are addressed to the dual use. In other words, the modern technologies in Russia were not invented by Russians, they were taken from the West. And not only taken, but they were produced outside of Russia. In other words, you are not in a position, in case that I would ask you, can you tell me what is the Russian product of the, with the modern technologies offered for the broader public? For example, mobile telephones, or I would say television, radio, all that is simply not only based on the technologies, but even produced outside of Russia. Now, once again, as it happened in the 30s and then in the Stalinist period, Russia proclaimed the policy of autarky, that everything should be produced in Russia. We have talented people. Yes, Russia, in my view, the greatest resource of Russia is not gas and oil, but exactly human capital. They have very talented people, very highly educated in physics, in mathematics, etc. But unfortunately, up to now, there is no one product. I can even not tell you, frankly, I wanted to know what is originally produced in Russia when you have the United States, who supported, I would say, the military-industrial complex in billions. But in very short period, these billions were a kind of the revenue offered to the broader public, because internet, GPS, and all that, it is a kind of the byproduct of the military technologies which were originally invented with an intention to develop, I would say, the new arms. In case of Russia, the armaments in Russia are comparable to the United States, and in some sectors even more effective. I have to say that it is the new element which is by many ignored or marginalized, overseen. It is militarization of the Russian economy. In other words, they consider militarization as a kind of the new engine to put for the Russian economy a kind of the fresh air. But the result is what we have seen, I would say, with the Stalinist militarization, that it was the origin of the of collapse of the Russian economy. In other words, in my view, this is very, very serious problem, that the sanctions should be selected, and they should not be oriented against, I would say, the population, because in my view, Russia's population will not react in a way as people are reacting in the West. I would say 2% decrease of the standard of life in Belgium or France will have a very dramatic, I would say, change of public opinion. In Russia, they will not notice even. Not only 2%, but even 20% or 30%. I would like to say that it is another society, and in order not to speak too wrong, in my view, one should take under consideration that mentality and psychology of the Russian people is really a different one. It is not different because they are not, I would say, the Western countries, but it is different because of the historical development. They do not have an experience of the democratic society, and in my view, one should not address something against people, but against those who are responsible for that aggressive policy developed in recent period.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Giorgi, first of all, sanctions, reply to that. And secondly, what if indeed the federal budget shrinks in Russia, which it appears to? They won't be able to fund, for example, your neighbors in the North Caucasus to the same degree. So we're not talking about necessarily public revolt in Moscow, but could this result in more regional assertiveness? Some of the local governors, let's say, trying to find alternative sources to their legitimacy from Moscow, or revolt against the alternative governors. Give us your view.
Sure, but I'm tempted to say 2 words about mentality. So many was spoken about that, and my personal small story, and my family had many friends in Moscow from liberal parts, in no way pro-Soviet period, and I was interacting with them a lot, and with kids of my age, and once, I'm told, when I was a real kid, we had an exotic debate, who has more resources, Georgia or Russia? I was really a shameless kid to argue about the size of the resources, and as I'm told, in a dispute, the other one, son of my parents' friends, was a good kid, so he was truthful, so I was kind of winning a debate, again, in a cocky manner, and suddenly came an answer, but we have cotton in Kazakhstan. So, I mean, even in a liberal family, you are right. So it was not overall the wrong people that you were talking about. This is a deep problem. But my point is, we should not dwell about mysterious Russian soul too much, because it's a losing game. We should speak about how to contain and defeat them. That's the point. And supporting Ukraine is one big step in defeating Putin and Kremlin. I think it's a very simple truth. So sanctions are just one part of it, but only one part. And I think it's good that they were introduced. They started with individuals. The sectorial ones is a good step again, but I think everybody now agrees that they must expand quite rapidly and as a reaction to what happens on the ground. And not only Timchenko should be targeted, but Gunvar must be made dysfunctional. Not only oil part of Gazprom should be targeted, which is tiny, but Rosneft, and so on. But I'm deeply convinced, as biased as I am, that sanctions can be effective only if it's part of the much wider range strategy. And this strategy includes ideological battle, as I already mentioned. And here, I wouldn't count about like immediate effect of convincing Russian people that in Crimea, Russia is morally wrong and it's not Russia. What would work more, and of course, the Democrats, dissidents must be supported, that's a crucial part too, but only that also will not work. What will be a bit more effective is if there's a concentrated effort, not propaganda, but the truth, concentrated effort to reach Russian people with large stories of corruption and nepotism and how their wealth is mismanaged by Putin. That will be more effective. But even more effective would be an example of Ukraine and Georgia and others, a democracy built around them, which would show them that how people live in different way. And again, here, obviously, Baltic states, Poland, who were former Soviet colonies in a way, unfortunately, serve as an example of transformation. But for Russians, they were still always alien. That's a compliment to Baltics and Poland especially. Ukraine, first of all, and even Georgia, it's considered that it's part of the national body, ours, this Eurasianist culture. And if things happen differently there, that's a big blow. Maybe not immediate decisive, but big blow. So I completely agree with Minister Tarasiuk on that. But, and last time, I'll be finished, I mean, security component. Now, this is not serious. When we're talking about real pushback, and Ukraine, as far as at least as I know, is not getting any significant security assistance and security equipment. And my country also has not got anti-air and anti-tank capabilities, no training for territorial defense, no instructors. This is a big problem for containment, physical problem for resistance, and a problem of a message in ideological battle. Sending equipment is a strong ideological message. Not sending it and making it public is also a strong message, but rather a very dangerous one. Not even being ready to signal a realistic pathway towards EU membership or NATO membership is a very, very dangerous signal, because we have Eastern Partnership, Association Agreement, very good steps, and there's a principle of more for more, but there is reluctance to even say that EU membership is at the end of the road. So all of those components together, security, ideological pushback, economic sanctions, containment, confronting them everywhere, just as it was in good old Cold War days. And so I don't know where it will happen, but I mean, I think with or without changing the mentality of Russian nation, Putin can be defeated and he will be defeated. But time might be very dramatic for some of nations which are the neighbor and some which are even further. So we better hurry up in crafting this strategy.
My double-barrel question for Boris, actually, and you've already raised this. One, what is the view from Kiev on the sanctions that have been imposed thus far on Russia? And secondly, what is the view in Kiev of the lack of support for your security from the West, that presumably you expected more when this invasion began?
About sanctions, to my mind, sanctions were invented by the European Union and Washington as a quasi-response to aggressive Russia. So it was demonstrated in public statements like there is no military solution. So further statement, we are not going to send weapons to Ukraine. So isn't it the invitation for Putin for further aggressiveness? Yes, it is invitation. Instead, the policy of sanctions was invented, you know, to make it as a substitute for the real adequate reaction from the West. To my mind, for the time being, these sanctions are not adequate. And I think that only sanctions which may lead to the reduction, considerable reduction of oil price, and isolation of Russia from the global financial and banking system, or the SWIFT. So these are the sanctions which may really hurt Russia if we are speaking about non-military response. I think that speaking about the reaction from our partners, I was really surprised and astonished at the lack of reaction, adequate reaction from both NATO and Washington. When Russia committed aggression against Ukraine, there were at least 2 countries in the world who had political commitments before Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. These were the United States and United Kingdom. So tell me, today we heard from one of these representatives of one of these countries that Ukraine is doing not enough in terms of reform. I agree. But what did those 2 countries did in order to implement their commitments? So in not implementing their commitments, which were connected with the nuclear status of Ukraine, not status, but nuclear weapons in Ukraine, so is leading to the corrosion of non-proliferation regime the world over. And now you will not convince any country in the world which is on the threshold of acquiring nuclear weapons to stop acquiring nuclear weapons, because you have no arguments. What you are going to give in exchange? Guarantees? No guarantees. So that's why I think that in the Ukrainian public opinion, more and more growing concern over the giving up nuclear weapons at the beginning of the 90s. And even in the parliament, we have a draft resolution which is urging Ukrainian government to not to ratify, but to
renew?
No. To abandon denunciation, thank you, Gary. Denunciation of Ukraine's joining non-proliferation nuclear treaty. So this is a very dangerous consequences of the countries who happen to be guarantors not to commit their guarantees. So again, about the response. The only possible response, now Ukraine is alone fighting with the 3rd biggest military power in the world. So we have no military assistance from neither Washington nor from NATO in any capitals. So is it a real response? This is not. This is an attempt to, to hide out, to say that this is not something which is concerning us, beloved. This is something which is the concern of Ukraine and Russia. Let them deal with it, and that's why the Minsk agreement, emerged, and which was absolutely wrong decision to take, because not a single country with the separatism on their territories have legitimized separatism, but Ukraine did. So this was a mistake by our leadership, by our new leadership, as a result of so-called recommendations or instructions from abroad. So I have a lot to say about wrong reaction from the West towards Russian aggression against Ukraine, but I see that Janusz is nervous.
I don't mind what you say, but it's just the time. But maybe we can come back to this in some of the questions. Cyril, in particular, what is the view from the street in Czech Republic? I mean, the memories of '68 are still there,
I speak of the streets in Prague. So, whenever I prepare something, my wife asks me, do you take it seriously? It is from your point of view, it is a serious case. If it's a case, please do it. So Europe is a very strange continent. We are a continent of 48 countries. We do not understand each other. The only common language of Europe is translation. That's why I am happy for representing EU, which is capable of having consensus on some sanctions as a symbolic position that we are ready to take something seriously. That's, from my point of view, it's a good starting point for the further or future negotiation with Russia. Because in Ukraine, so we need to have a peace with Russia. I think that it is impossible to win the battle, because it is one chapter is the question of the sanctions. The other chapter we are to open, it is International Monetary Fund agreed to lend Ukraine 17 billion US dollars. Kiev has received 7 billion. The Ukraine economy could fall by 10% from one year to another year. So there's a permanent crisis in Ukraine. I'm terribly sorry, but we have to transform everything, including the political system. I am terribly sorry what I'm not going to say. Even some politicians, they were in power in the past, and now they do represent the new system. So it will be extremely costly solution. So in Luhansk, there's a gap of 85% in the production. In Donetsk region, 60%. And the new chapter is who is ready to pay this rebuild of the Ukrainian economy, the new political system, the new legal system. It will be politically and economically extremely costly. And I think that it is in the mind of the Russian leaders, because it will be the long-term strategy who is capable of paying this way of the reconciliation and reconstruction of Ukraine. It will be the challenge for the European Union, for us, because it is the policy of the carrot and sticks. So, and we need now to present the carrot. And it is a new challenge which is before us. So, back to your question. So, one chapter is the sanctions. They have impact, and they could help for starting the negotiations. I think that Germany could play a very important role in this way. But the new challenge is more complicated. And as we used to say in the Czech Republic, everyone knows how to reform everything, but no one knows how to win the next elections. So we are of the presentism, to be concentrated on the present time, not to lose future, not to lose our friends. And it will be a tough job which is before Europe, and this is a test of ability of Europe to stick together.
Okay, thank you, Cyril. Let's open up to the audience now. I know everybody's dying to ask questions. I'll take about 2 or 3, and if you could be 1 concise, 2 introduce yourselves, and 3 state your affiliation. Please, who is first? And we have microphones. Gary, are you itching here? You need a microphone. It's coming.
Thank you very much. I try to be concise, but I couldn't avoid responding to the same lamenting comments about mysterious Russian soul. Look, I'm getting annoyed hearing the same story about genetic fate of certain nations, which is refuted by certain examples. Korea, in 60 years, you have 2 different nations, and they're not even cousins, they're brothers and sisters. Same people 60 years ago, today look very different. Once, one part lived in Gulag, another one created one of the most successful nations in the world. China and Taiwan, I'm sorry, it's the same nation. Again, and you have 2 different countries. You could see in Hong Kong, people who were born in a free country, they acted differently. And when you make correct comments about reaction of Russian public to Putin's new acquisition, quote unquote, of Crimea, yes, absolutely. I'm sure, we saw it in documentaries, Germans were cheering when part of Czechoslovakia was taken by the Third Reich without a single shot, did they? Now, what would have happened if somebody could show them the picture of American bombs dropped on Hamburg in 4 years later? I'm not sure they would be cheering, with the same enthusiasm. It's all about the price people are willing to pay, and I think it's one. I've been trying to communicate the message when I was on stage. Our task is to send this message to Russian youth. There will be a price. You have to ask them: are they willing to stop traveling to Côte d'Azur, to Spanish Mediterranean cities, to Italy? Are they willing to stop having property in Czech Republic as a price for having Crimea? Put the price on the table, and I'm sure the reaction will be very, 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 very different. And again, my question is I have no doubt that Putin has no choice but to strike again. And while we're talking about the ways of toppling Putin's regime or just making sure he leaves Kremlin, don't forget, from history we know that one of the ways this to happen is military defeat. And military defeat is not just, occupation of the country. It could be unacceptable price in human lives, body bags, as happened in Afghanistan, by the way. And naturally, Putin considers very high cost of further aggression against Ukraine. Now, my question is, do you think that Putin's next strike is imminent? And if yes, is it Ukraine, North Kazakhstan, Georgia, Azerbaijan, the South, or Baltics?
Mm-hmm. Very good question. A couple more questions, please, over here. If you could be a little bit brief, I allowed Gary a little bit more time because it addressed something he was passionate about.
Sorry, my name is Per Nyholm, I'm from Denmark. Just in connection with this, the price. Two possibilities. Can the panel imagine that sooner or later it would be possible for Ukraine to sell Crimea to Russia for any sum of money, and thereby, so to say, legalize the business? And I would add to that, I would be happy not to receive within Europe about 1 million or 1.5 million communist nostalgics of Russian origin presently living in Crimea. So maybe one should think actually of selling Crimea. And the second, the price otherwise. Could one imagine that also in other spheres we make life very difficult for the Russian aggressors? We could encourage nationalism in North Caucasus. We could encourage the Chinese to move in Siberia. There are already millions of Chinese there. We could encourage
this is getting very exciting now.
Nationalism with a view to creating an independent Siberian republic.
Mm-hmm. This is a suggestion or a threat?
It's recommendation.
It is a consideration. You may use it.
No.
I'm just asking, what would be the opinion of the panel?
Sure, very good questions. Maybe one more and then we'll throw it back to the panel. A gentleman over here.
I'm Tom Yeager with the Bugajski Foundation. I've heard a lot of things today in this panel about whose fault it is that Crimea was lost, that Ukraine didn't respond more forcefully, that we haven't sent particular kinds of aid, that we haven't supported Ukraine adequately, but I haven't heard really any direct suggestions for what we should be doing now to reverse that, and specifically what Europe should be doing now to help reverse that. I certainly admit that the United States has a great responsibility, but I'll observe that Ukraine is in Europe, not in North America. And that if the United States were to try by itself to reverse this and to undertake some of the kinds of military assistance or financial assistance you've been suggesting, the American people would reject that, and absent European intention to do the same, they would be right to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Cyril, maybe you go first. Is the Russian soul an ephemeral ghost?
No, I will answer the last question, because, when we were before joining EU, we have to transform our system, and it was difficult, but we were capable of doing that. But if Poroshenko takes seriously the real reform in Ukraine, it will be politically extremely costly. So my answer to your question is, what is, from my point of view, highly needed is to prepare a general plan how to help the process of rebuilding the Ukrainian economy, transition, and to demonstrate that Europe is capable of paying this solution, because we need a positive signal. Because believe me, when Poroshenko decides to kick out people from the public administration, to realize the social reform, he will immediately thousands of people in the streets demonstrating against him. It will be the case. It was the same in Greece. So we know it because, if people are in a very bad social situation, so they prefer to live and not to support the idea. So please, believe me, my answer to your question is that we need a general plan how to help.
And the Russian soul?
So I think that we have no chance to change the system in Russia. And to your comment, I have a good friend in Prague. He's a Russian, and he told me, I am happy for being in the Czech Republic. I would never return back to Russia. So he is engineer. He has got two girls. They attend the Anglo-American University. But whenever we open the discussion on Putin, his answer is, I am totally behind him.
Ask him to choose between Crimea and his business.
Yes, so...
Maybe, Boris, if you could hold fire just for a second, because Giorgi wants to jump in.
So, very briefly on this point about reform, transformation, cost, and criticism of the current leadership. In principle, of course, I agree that as part of the strategy of pushback, which, as I repeat again, must include security component for sure, and complex strategy, supporting democracy and pushing for change and reform must be part of it, because that's part of the blow to Putin. And we know from our own experience in the past and from Yanukovych's experience that in this region and this context, backsliding on reform and democracy has geopolitical consequences. It pushes country to Putin, and in my case, in case of Georgia, that's the biggest worry now, that the country is backsliding and jailing political opponents, the big threat, and so it must be pushed. But this push will be effective and there'll be much more leverage if it's in a package of full-blown engagement, and I'm sorry I'm repeating again, which includes full-blown presence and security. And I agree with the comment that it should be a joint Euro-Atlantic effort. I agree with that, but it's not there, at least it's not visible, and this is a problem for everything, for transformation, for effective push and transformation, for anything. Now, going back to the really interesting question about selling Crimea, it's the same crucial problem. Even if Crimea is given for free to Russia, that is not solving anything. I mean, they took parts of my country's territory and have paid no price, de facto, for a long time, and then they even enlarged it recently through the invasion, and unfortunately, there was by far not enough reaction. Business as usual was restored, and many people predicted that Crimea could have been next. Unfortunately, it did happen, because, as I said from the beginning, the core of the Putin and Kremlin regime is not Crimea, is not even Ukraine. Ukraine is a huge goal because it's part of the bigger strategy, and there is no way of turning away from that. And I honestly don't know the answer to Gary's question, where it will happen. I don't have enough information, but I'm sure, of course, that he's contemplating measuring and raising the stakes at any moment that he will consider it beneficial for himself to strike. And unless, again, there will be a comprehensive pushback by Euro-Atlantic unity, and it will be uncompromising pushback without calculations about immediate deal possible. Because if the other side knows that the one on this side is so desperate to have a deal, that, of course, weakens the position. And last but not the least, I can't agree more with Mr. Kasparov here on Russian people, again, without even daring to blunder into this huge philosophical debate about mysterious soul. I mean, the leadership must be dealt a blow, and it has not happened, and until it will happen, other efforts will be either completely fruitless or will be really minuscule. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the regime relies on such myths, basically, to stay in power.
And he had not had a bloody nose enough in the vision of, and he cannot hide it. There's enough instruments to penetrate the information, so Russian people, whatever their description is, they will see that. And by the way, Korean example, there are other examples elsewhere too, is very telling really how people develop. I mean, I think even physically there was a recent survey that there is a difference in hate, that South Koreans are higher for 20 centimeters or something. Thank you.
Boris, I presume Ukraine's not for sale.
No, definitely not. About the questions, nobody can predict now, even in this audience, what will be next Putin's, steps. So a lot of questions why Putin sent warships to the Northeast Atlantic. Nobody can say why Russians have launched a mysterious satellite, probably a satellite killer. Nobody can predict. So that's why I'm not going to speculate on this subject. As to the question of selling the Crimea, forgive me, but what about selling part of your country? Nobody in Ukraine is thinking in this term. So we lost the Crimea. Because of the recommendations, we lost the Crimea, but we never agree that the Crimea will be lost forever. We consider Crimea part of our territory, temporarily, not under our control. As to the possible scenarios for Russia itself, I do not exclude that Russia may be disrupted, but a lot of things had to happen. There is one very promising neighbor of Russia, who knows? As to what to do, yes, indeed, the United States is not in Europe, but this was the United States government and the President of the United States who signed himself the National Security Assurances Memorandum for Ukraine. Everybody has to respond to the commitments. Ukraine has implemented its part of the commitment. We have abandoned nuclear weapons, the third largest nuclear potential in the world, with the insistence of the United States and Russia. So we have no debts before nobody. But the rest of the world has debts before Ukraine. And nobody can complain about Ukraine's activity until the time that this country will help in reality increasing military capability of Ukrainians who are fighting alone against Russia. And I would not overestimate the constitutional powers of current president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko. He has not such powers, to empower everything in Ukraine. He's just one of the institute of power. And by the way, let me remind you that Ukraine is currently parliamentary presidential republic, not presidential parliamentary, but parliamentary presidential. That means that the more power is with the government, not with the president. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris. Adam, you wanted to jump in?
Yes. First of all, I would like to say that it is very convincing what Garry Kasparov said about divided nations, Korea, China, Germany. But I would like to say that on one hand, it is true that Taiwan is much more productive than China. But I would like to recollect, I would say, the fact that the transformation of the police system in Taiwan, it was initiated later than the perestroika in the Soviet Union. In other words, it was 2 years after Gorbachev, they started to change the very dictatorial system. The same it was with Lee Sin-man in South Korea. I would like to say that recently I'm reading now the book, biography, the German biography of one of the German presidents whom I respect very much. His name is Richard von Weizsäcker. I know him personally, and I do respect him very much. And I'm very much astonished reading this book that he was a person, as a son of the Secretary of State under Nazi regime in Ribbentrop. His father, Ernst von Weizsäcker, was responsible for many decisions which were connected with the genocide during the Second World War. Nevertheless, his son decided to defend him, and as one of the elements of the defense of his father, he defended the decision that his father invented Munich Agreement of '38. In other words, for a German who is, I would say, one of the best representatives of the German intellectuals and the very highly respected person, Munich Agreement, even now, 70 years after the Second World War, is something what was positive simply by the fact that it was done in peaceful way, that his father was able to prevent the war, to prevent the attack of Germany against Czechoslovakia, and later on this agreement, as you know, opened the way to liquidate the statehood of Czechoslovakia in general, because the 29th of September was the Munich Agreement, and the 15th of March '39 the Czechoslovakia was liquidated. Altogether, I would like to say that I'm saying this in the context of different spiritual background of different nations. Having said that, I would like to say that as far as Georgia is concerned, I don't know whether it is true, but some friends of mine told me that Georgia, which was governed for some years by Saakashvili, who was not my cup of tea, but in general, I supported him as newcomer, as a kind of the person with the fresh view, that under this Saakashvili's period, it was possible to be effective in combating corruption in Georgia to a much greater extent than people were able to think about, especially in the police. And corruption, which was in the Georgian culture something very deep inherited. It was possible. I'm saying this with a sense that to support what Gary Kasparov said, that it is possible to do something against, I would say, this spiritual background with an intention. In other words, people, they do behave in different way within different regimes. If it is a liberal democratic regime, people behave, I would say, within the concept, philosophical concept of liberal democracy. And recently, as you know, one of the American, thinkers or the expert in international law, whose name is John Mearsheimer, published, I would say, a text in Foreign Affairs saying that it is that Western liberal Democrats provoked Putin to invade Ukraine. I would like to say that it was, for me, a kind of the combination of ignorance with arrogance. In other words, he is on one hand very respected person as the international lawyer, and I do remember, I would say, many studies he published in 1990, Back to the Future, about Europe. But on the other hand, it is not only Mearsheimer, there are many others. In other words, all those so-called quote-unquote realists, that school of realists who were against, I would say, extension of NATO, they are now saying that in all that happened, what happened now in Ukraine, it is a kind of the deep-rooted in the 90s, because we have done something what provoked Putin. I would like to say that Putin is not provoked. It is his decision, his responsibility, and he is not the person who will find the solution of the problems which were created by his policy, but in my view, it is the key element, what was in common for all of us, and I suppose also in the audience, that the fundamental point of reference is that the West has to be united. Not aggressive, but united. And the common response to Russia will definitely taken in very serious way. In other words, Russia is the stronger, the weaker is the West. And this uniting the West is now very important element how to prevent the assistance to Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. By the way, there was a very good response and critique of Mersheimer by Alexander Motyl. No, Motyl did a very good critique, actually. Let me jump to the audience, actually, Giorgi. Maybe you can say during the course of the answers. We have time for one more round of questions, so I see a hand lady here and then a gentleman over here. Please, again, be brief. Think of time.
Thank you. Anastasia Sergeyeva, International Republican Institute. As it usually turns, a discussion about civil society in Russia and its opportunities came to discussion about Putin's power. I would like to ask a question about civil society in Russia, finally. As Garry Kasparov has told, there are about 10% of Russian citizens who are strictly opposite to Putin even now. And in absolute numbers, it is about 10 million people. I have a question, and most part of them are representatives of this civil society, which is of course weak, which has no leadership and so on. But I would like to ask you, and as Mr. Bokeria has told, one of the tasks is to have some support, to give some support to pro-democracy forces in Russia. So what messages have you to them? Could you send to them? What messages of support? What maybe doors you can open to them in your countries, in other countries of Europe, of the United States, just to these people who are opposite to Putin right now and who probably could have a chance to change the country one day. Thank you.
Thank you. I had this question. Thank you for asking this, because I had this question in reserve in case this question didn't come up. So thank you for asking. Please, gentleman over here.
I come from Azerbaijan, Baku, and I'm a PhD candidate at University of German Federal Armed Forces in Hamburg. Well, this session's title is really interesting, Managing Russian Assertiveness in the Post-Cold War Era. And one of the weaknesses of Europe in this regard has been its response to Russia's divide and control policies in some of the former Soviet countries. And Azerbaijan's Nagorno-Karabakh territory and some districts have been invaded by Armenia, we know it, and this has largely been with the support...
Could you jump to the question, I'm sorry, without the history?
By Russian support. So, and now we have OSCE Minsk group, in which the West is participating, and Russia is participating, and the West has always claimed that it is maintaining its values in all regards, including external democracy promotion as well as conflict prevention. However, the practice has shown that this is not the case, and the EU is reluctant to get involved in the Russian affairs, which also includes Nagorno-Karabakh case.
What is the question? I'm sorry,
we have... The question is that why do you think that the West or the EU has so long been reluctant to get involved in frozen conflicts? Obviously, there is no frozen conflict in our territory.
Okay, that's it. Thanks for the question. Any more short question? Maybe lady here, last person, last orders.
Hello, my name is Julia Skurska and I'm from Cambridge University Center for Energy Policy Studies. A few weeks ago, actually, at Cambridge, in the Cambridge Union, which is arguably a representative debating House for Public Opinion, there's been a debate titled Whether Putin is a Threat to Global Security. And a very strong side of that debate claimed that Putin is only rearranging the former borders of the Soviet state. Through the discussions here, it's occurred to me that the response of the West has been criticized heavily, and perhaps for the fact that a lot of the West does not consider this to be a global threat, but a very local threat. So what's your response to that? And also, since there are a lot of recommendations for how to take good actions, how to take action, how do you really make sure that that action is taken and that priority is sort of lifted up on the political agenda of the West, United States, so on and so forth? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll start in descending order. Cyril?
Yes, so I will be very brief in the answer. So the first question is civic society. My experience from my country is, of course, the elite of the civic society is capable of changing the system if there is a real desire in the society. There's a need of real desire for the change, and the desire in my country was obvious to everyone, even the representatives of the Communist Party. They in the very end, they said yes to the change because the elite just expressed the will of the real desire in society. And I don't see the real desire in the Russian society. I'm sorry. But that's my comment. The question of the global threat, in my view, so it has been said, the Russian strategy is to revitalize the real influence and power on the territory of former Soviet Union. And this is the end. I don't believe that there's a real threat to the Europe or to the Western countries. So in my view, this is also, maybe I do represent minority in this society, but I think that the strategy is just to revitalize the real influence in the Russian-speaking countries.
We should do a conference about this. Yep. It's a huge subject. Boris?
Cyril, I would recommend you to tell about this to Latvians and Estonians.
Unless you don't consider them part of Europe.
About the civil society, a message to Russian civil society. Let me tell you briefly about Ukrainian civil society. In 2004, after the falsification of presidential elections, these were the political parties who took a lead in protest, and the civil society joined. Together, we gained the victory. In 2013, a year ago, this was a civil society which started a protest, and the political parties were ready to help in its organizational capabilities. So that's what we have done. I don't see, a comparable strong civil society and political groups in Russia who can do the same. So the only message we Ukrainians can send to Russian civil society, do like we did. As to Nagorno-Karabakh, this is not my subject because as a co-president of Euronest Parliamentary Assembly, we had a lot of headaches in trying to mediate between Azerbaijanians and Armenians, although as a Ukrainian, I would say that we are definitely on the side of Azerbaijan. As to the local threat, I would not underestimate these aggressive actions of Russia as a local threat. This is the threat for the time being to one country after Georgia, but with a global consequences. So the response should be global wise, not local. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris. Giorgi?
Thank you. Try to be brief, and thank you for noting the important transformation which happened in my country in the last 10 years, and it's true. There was a very strong stereotype that it was endemic and nothing had changed, not only on corruption, but on crime, on public services, and with all the flaws that we as a political team had in our reforms, I think it's hard to doubt that this has been delivered. It's very regrettable that the new government is backsliding on that and other issues, because we had a first peaceful transfer of power, which was also an important precedent. But so far it sticks, so it shows again that anything can happen. My major point still is that I don't want to speculate what is or is not possible with respect of Russian society. Let's put this aside, this issue, because I think it's just time consuming, and at least I don't feel I'm an expert at all. But I think there's no doubt about pushback, or there is some doubt because Mr. Svoboda has said that it is very local. If I dare to say, I personally remember some of the very good people, dedicated Europeans, telling us the same about after Georgia invasion, that we were wrong to consider that it will continue, and we were fear-mongering when we were talking about Crimea as next target. Yeah, well, and Georgia is not Russian-speaking, by the way, and neither is Ukraine. And by the way, the threat to Europe, it's a problematic message, because Ukraine is Europe. And there was a time historically, and I'm going to quote the German Minister of Defense, when about Czechoslovakia, it was said that it's a far country that we know little. Now, again, I'm not drawing parallels, historic parallels, they are not exact, but I think it's dangerous. And the problem is that in this debate, for those who think that it's a global challenge to be proven right, it must be a tragic development. So I don't wish to win this debate in order to be proven. I not frequently agree with Mr. Soros's geopolitical views, but recently he had a very good article where I think he went even as far as to argue that even for US interest, the threat of ISIL cannot be compared with the threat of the situation in Ukraine. And I believe so. And let me make it very clear. Ukraine has a very specific reason to speak about commitments. I'm speaking as a Georgian citizen. I'm not claiming that there is any moral obligation on our American friends who've done so much for Georgia throughout the years, which we will always be grateful for. There is none. But I would dare to suggest a pragmatic argument, which coincides with the moralistic in this case, and in some other cases too, that Europe without US, and US withdrawing from Europe de facto, or saying that it's European business, I mean, projecting US power in the world, I mean, it would be deeply problematic. And I'm not speaking as an altruist. I mean, US as an idea and as a symbol means so much for my generation of Georgians at least, and for future generations, I hope. But pragmatically, if that happens, we are all in deep trouble. And that's the point to consider. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Giorgi. Adam, you have the last word.
Well, I would like to say that, first of all, as far as the frozen conflicts, I would like to say that it happened that I dealt with almost all these frozen conflicts, both as a researcher, but to a great extent practitioner. And by the way, we met each other with Borys for the first time in Kiev in December '92 on my trip to Kiev and to Moscow, with an intention, I would say, to have a blessing of Ukraine and Russia for the solution I wanted to present to the Ministerial Council of the OSCE. And I would like to say that, by the way, it is more than 20 years past since then, and the solution which I propose is functioning. It is, I would say, always when you are able to prevent the bloody conflict, people are not speaking about that. The subject of interest for the press and public is the conflicts which are still going on, I would say, with a lot of blood, fire, etc. When something is done, it is considered as something normal. However, it is not a kind of the permanent solution, because in my view, this type of conflicts can never be solved in 1 or 2 generations, because one should see what is going on in Russia, not only from the perspective as we have done in our discussion here, but to see Russia as the last colonial empire in the world. We have 3 continental empires after the First World War. It was the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian. Ottoman Empire and Austro-Hungarian, they collapsed totally, and many new nations emerged in Europe. As far as Russia, it was transformed into the Soviet Union, and Soviet Union into the Russian Federation, but it is still, I would say, the problem of the metropolis, the colony. I would like to say that with the decolonization, it is a problem even in the overseas territories. France lost, I would say, Indochina, and it was taken by the United States later on, the responsibility as the result of the catastrophe in Dien Bien Phu. Then in Algeria, it was, I would say, the bloody war with the million of people who lost their life, and it was very difficult for French generals to accept that Algeria, it is an independent country. For Russia, it is so as well difficult to accept that Ukraine has to be an independent country. It is, I would say, in their way of thinking, it is semi-independent, it is semi-sovereign. And what I'm saying, it is not only that I think so, but I know for sure, I was told by semi-official Russians, they told me that Ukraine can exist as a country with a limited sovereignty, otherwise it will be a war. Now, having said that, by the way, when I was told, I reacted in a very emotional way, but it was the emotion under control, because my intention was to tell them that it is not acceptable, this type of language. I would like to say that, in my view, this is the problem, that we have to find a solution which should be creative, innovative, without a great war. And I would like to say that for the Europeans, it is very difficult to change their way of thinking, because the perception of, self-perception of Europe, Western Europe, is the huge Switzerland. In other words, they would like to be very comfortable, a little bit hedonistic, with the high standard of life, a kind of the country with a lot of vacations in different parts of the world. In other words, they do consider that it is the end of the wars in general. Unfortunately, it is not the case, and Europeans are now, and this is contribution of Russia, Europeans are called to take the world in totally different way, to be serious, that it could be the end of the wars in Europe under the condition that aggressors will be stopped. And what happened in Ukraine, by the way, it seems to me that it is in action. The very weak Ukrainian army was able, I would say, to stop the aggression in southeastern Ukraine. I listened with great attention to Boris' explanation what is going on, but in my view, we have to be a little bit more creative in suggesting what should be done by us, not by Ukrainians, because each and every country should do it for itself. In other words, we should not recommend to Ukrainians, but we should recommend to ourselves what has to be done.
Thank you very much, Adam. Post-final comment.
Yeah,
literally
30 seconds. 30 seconds.
20.
I forgot 20.
Okay.
On Azerbaijan, a key factor for our region, a strategic partner for Georgia, and I can't agree, unfortunately, that not addressing this problem, which has been created and crafted by Russia throughout the years, and is a big factor of destabilizing the whole region, is a big problem for the stability of the whole region. So I completely agree with you.
Thank you very much, Giorgi. Last note, thank you to our panelists, to our audience, and to our organizers for making this possible, and let's do it again soon. Thank you.